conversation about the arts and culture that has extended more than 30 seconds, where the issue of funding hasn't come up yet. Where the issue is, how do you pay for this? How do you get this done? But of course, one of the things we're talking about here is how do you use the arts to produce social change, not just the arts for art's sake. And that creates new kinds of challenges. And I mean, Darren, you have one of the largest philanthropies in the world that you're dealing with, tackling these issues. When you listen to the kinds of questions we're talking about here, is the funding out there? Are there opportunities? Or is this a deficit we need to address?
Thank you, David. Yes, the funding's out there. The question is, how do we deploy philanthropy to advance art and artists and strengthen the ecosystem for art and culture and for social progress? Artists have always been a part of the narrative of progress in any society. And certainly in the United States, without artists, it's hard to imagine how America could be America without Joan Baez singing in the 1960s, without Harry Belafonte on the front lines with Dr. King for civil rights and racial justice. So the question is, how do we use philanthropy, like the Ford Foundation, and private philanthropy, and the public resources to advance social change through the arts?
You guys are trying to do that. Talk about how you're trying to do it.
I fully agree. I mean, we're going to do that. I mean, we are a private foundation, and we decided actually because of, and I've heard these words a lot, we talk about big words like dignity or holistic education, but we forget that when you talk about dignity, it means developing, it means hope, it means much more than feeding refugees or basic needs. So that was actually the motivation why we have done what I think we can do as private foundations. We can leverage, we can showcase, we can try to find these beautiful small initiatives, but also support larger institutions and build bridges when they really are willing to open up and make arts accessible. I think that's the role, but still, I think we need the state. I still think it's such a shame, and I say this, it's just a shame, and I feel, I'm from the capital of music, you could say Vienna, but you know what? We don't have the music in schools. And of course it would be affordable.
By the way, there are people here who might not consider Vienna the capital of music, okay? Now, we can debate that later. I don't think we have time right now, but go ahead.
No, but I really think it's not just in so-called non-development countries or non-developed countries. It's like in the capitals that it doesn't happen. And we are talking still about holistic education and talking about social and emotional skills and all these things, but it doesn't happen. And I think there is enough money and already out there. It's just a question of distribution. It's a question of where we set priorities. And I think what we do and hopefully do, we try to leverage and find these beautiful, good practices and hopefully also leverage the state. And I think we have to do much more advocacy work on this, that things are going to change. Because I don't believe that if we put all the money together, private money, we don't change. We have to be clear. It's important, but it's a minimal percentage. So we have to go into the systems too. That's my true belief. And that's what we try to fight and also support initiatives going towards back into, for instance, the school system, or also working with larger institutions that they open up, but not just one-off, a nice one-off thing. It's really about a program where they make arts accessible.
You know, it's interesting. When I go around and I talk to people about this, in the United States, the complaint is, if only we had more government funding. And when I go elsewhere in the world, they say, if only we had more private philanthropy. and it's like the grass is always greener. And you're exposed to kind of a new piece of grass where the system isn't completely set up yet. And I'm wondering how that tension is being resolved and how it pertains to what these gentlemen have talked about.
Thank you. There's so much I want to say, but I always hate being in the place between people's lunch So I'll try to make
Yeah,
this
no,
as
it's
quickly
very
as I-
dangerous
it's
to
so
stand
bad.
between a crowd and their lunch, but give it a shot.
You know, I think the UAE is such a fascinating place to examine these issues because I think that it is a young country, and like many startup countries, the government is usually the primary driver in the beginning of development across the board, not just with arts. You see here by the summit, and then also hopefully the things you'll see over the next week, that there really is a sincere interest on the part of the UAE government and Abu Dhabi especially to support arts. And when I say arts, I think it's also important to connect cultural heritage as well. The foundation, the Salama bint Nahyan Foundation, we just say SHF, SHF works a lot of times in the crux. But I think that what you're seeing in the UAE is the rise of private philanthropic organizations. Now, again, because it maybe isn't as a mature ecosystem as it is in other, in the US, for example, you see a lot of foundations are operating foundations. So they're not just the grant making, but they are also, so they do everything the grant makers do, which is, develop a strategy, really try and monitor the impact of the investment they're making, but also foundations here, and SHF definitely go, they scout out, they find kind of innovators and entrepreneurs in this field and then work with them to transform them into institutions. I think where it's going is I think the UAE is in a fascinating place now where you've seen private foundations, again, operating foundations, and I think you're going to start to see the entrance now of a lot of private corporate money coming in. I think a lot of, you've seen a lot of business leaders here in this country talking about wanting to give back, that the UAE has given them so much, and now it's time for them to give back and support. And it's amazing to be in a place where people really support arts and culture. It is not something that is a hard sell. I think the role for foundations
But some of these people are not going to leave now.
I think
And there's all sorts of immigration challenges, so.
I think the role for foundations like SHF can be to connect these private individuals with strategic initiatives and really form and help create the third sector that maybe isn't as evolved as it would be in older countries.
But I think the risk here is that private philanthropy is usually represented the resources of the elite. And I think one of the dangers that we worry about in the United States is that during a time of growing inequality, having the private sector and private donors determine priorities for culture is problematic because culture is national identity. And if it is left to the elites to determine what the national identity is, then there will be people who are visible, who are usually advantaged, and people who are invisible, who are usually disadvantaged in that narrative. And so what we have to be mindful of, and we see it, I'll give you one example that was just in the New York Times. If you go to an American museum and you go to the American wing, you will see the art of Remington and Church and all of the great masters, the canonical American painters. You won't see Native American art. So when you go into the Metropolitan Museum and you look at the American wing and you go through it, there is no representation of American Indians. How can that be? They are as American as the Statue of Liberty. In fact, they were there before the Statue of Liberty. And
Which was made in France, anyway.
Which was made in France, thank you very much. But the challenge, and so while I am very, very grateful that my own institution exists as a result of the American imperative around philanthropy, there are risks with having more and more responsibility and authority vested in private interests in this space. And so I would caution my European and other friends who look at the United States with great envy because we have this private philanthropy.
Well, I think that's a very, very profound point. And it really, it gets to attention that I've seen in other areas. In other areas of foreign policy, you need development and so forth. For example, the governments want to cut back and they say, well, we'll let the Gates Foundation take care of it. And it's very nice that the Gates Foundation is there to pay for vaccines or whatever, but the Gates Foundation doesn't answer to the public interest. The Gates Foundation sets the priorities of the Gates, which is they're great. I'm not criticizing that. I'm merely saying there is a tension because the problems we're talking about here are on this level of society, and the donors are on this level of society, and reconciling those two things is a real challenge. Is it a challenge here? And how would you see it evolve?
You know, I think that has been the role that some foundations, and especially I think of SHF, I think of other organizations, Sharjah, that are kind of doing that. You know, they are the entities with the personal connections with the artistic community. You know, I think of, you know, for example, you know, a really interesting example is that, and this is the story, an example of unintended consequences, where perhaps you have patrons of the art who really want to support artists, and so perhaps they approach, you know, commissions, right? So they'll say, you know, okay, I'll buy your art, you know, and I think that is a real sense that it's a good intent. It's a good intention. They really want to support, but I think where foundations and other entities can come in is expand that dialogue and talk about how, yes, that might be one way to be a patron of the arts, but you know, we can, you know, at the foundation, we reach out, we talk to the artists, we actually ask them, like, what would be best, what do you need? Or we reach out to the public. One of the areas of the foundation works in is trying to expand audiences for the arts. So for it not to just be, especially for families and young children who probably won't, you know, go to the galleries and things like that, to get them to create spaces for them. And so it's really going to them and organically responding to them. And I have found that the private investors are really grateful for that. It's not that they don't want to do that, they just maybe don't have that connection. I think that's the role the foundations here can play right now, is kind of being that you know, I don't say expertise, but just being that person with that brain trust.
Well, it also suggests we're still in search of the model.
Well,
You know?
there is no one model.
Yeah.
But I do believe that what foundations can also do is to point out injustice and inequality. And so when we talk about something like arts education, elites' children are receiving arts education. They're receiving it in their private schools. They're receiving it because their parents can afford to take them to museums on trips around the world and those sorts of things. So the question is not that children aren't receiving arts education. Affluent children are receiving it. The question is, do poor children have a right to the arts? Do children from lower class communities, do children from the slums, do children, that's the question. So we should be clear about what the challenge is. The challenge is that if we see poor people, marginalized people as deficits, then we won't invest in them. If we see them as assets and as our future, we will see that it's essential that we invest in them, and that it's essential that the education that poor and low-income children receive is as good as that of the elites. That's where the rub is.
When perhaps part of the solution lies with conversation like we just heard from Octopizzo.
Yes.
That many of those people are creative, are a source of artistic energy, are a resource. And in fact, in many cases, some of the best art has come from those places. And so reconciling the tension may involve walking around the problem and seeing it from a different perspective, right? Werner, I sense you want to jump in.
Because I think it's so, and I think it's so important that you are saying this there, and that we have already divided systems. And again, we are talking about these holistic things and the whole society, but we leave more than half outside. I mean, in the education system, we have a divided system. We have the very private good schools, and we have like the poor public schools. It's not just, I think it's nearly all countries. And if we don't take care, and we have also, and there is another challenge in the privatization, it's not just the elite and the very poor one. I think it's also the thing that the society has delegated social things to private institutions. Those things are important, actually public goods to private institutions. And that's a big mistake. I think if we take this seriously, if we define arts as a basic need, it's a public good. So that means we are responsible as a whole. We are all responsible. I think we can be a convener. We can bring people together as private philanthropists, but we definitely have to point out that this is a public good and it cannot be privatized. I think that is crucial, and that's the fight we have to go. So we have to work together. It's also the other thing. I think we also have to bridge build. Even in the arts, we see there are the big institutions, and there are the freelancers, and there are some walls in between. We have fragmentation. How can we build bridges to actually go together and tell the governments, basic need, we have to think together how we finance this, and finance especially that the poor, that all poor people have access to the arts and not just some elite.
Well, I take Darren's comment to heart that there's not one model, that we have to create a kind of a hybrid system. But what are the gaps? What are the gaps that exist within the system? We have public, we have private. Clearly, we need public-private. You talk about a third sector. Maybe the foundations, are playing some role in defining that. But as we look to the kind of problems we're talking about here and solving those problems, what are the gaps that need to be filled?
I think the gap that needs to be filled is a recognition that we have a poverty of imagination when it comes to what is the potential of our fellow sisters and brothers. So in a place like America, too many Americans, when they look at a poor black neighborhood or see a group of young black men or see a group of immigrants who've come across the border, they see a problem. And so as long as we are in that mindset, it's hard to imagine how the potential of these people to be realized can occur. And so I agree with Werner about the potential of the arts. The arts are a critical ingredient for building empathy, and only with empathy can a society have justice and fairness. And so it's hard to imagine how in a country like America with a clear constitutional mandate for justice, how we can be a more just place without the arts. And so the challenge is that we've allowed a narrative to be created that says that the arts are for the elite, and therefore there is no need for government support, when in fact the arts is a public good. The arts is who we are as a people. And by not investing through public mechanisms, it's a statement about a deficit of who we are as a people. It's a scourge on our national narrative that we don't invest in the arts at a level where we should.
Well, we don't appreciate it, right? And I think, if you think back on some of the conversations we've had earlier today, the conversation you were talking and other people were talking about archaeology, and think back on history, what is left of civilizations that came before us? It's not piles of paper from bureaucracies. It's not political speeches, and it's not business plans, right? It's what the arts leave us. That is the legacy of civilizations. It is the byproduct that is the purpose of civilizations. But go ahead.
I just wanted to respond to what Darren said. I think here what's interesting to your question about maybe some of the gaps is that I feel that there does seem to be an acceptance here that art and culture, and especially culture, but arts too, is part of who they are. And one of the things that we find we're trying to do is also explain how everything else in society also needs the arts. So, diplomacy, the economy in particular. And so that is something that that it isn't, it's so fascinating to see different perspectives, where here I feel like it is widely accepted it is a public good. And what we're trying to do is actually show how it's more than just a public good. It's actually something that can be at the heart of your economy, innovation, diplomacy,
But in a lot of ways, what's happening here is what happened in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. It was, you are asserting your place on the global stage, and your own identity is being put forward with the full weight of the government behind you, because you have something to demonstrate to the world about what is happening in this special place called Abu Dhabi and these amazing emirates. In the United States in the 1950s and 60s, we did the same thing. The State Department had a huge budget for exporting American culture around the world. You saw dance companies, theater, performing artists, visual artists, traveling the world on behalf of the United States to tell our story, in part because we were concerned about the growth of communism, and we wanted to defeat the Russians. It's why we invested. It's why the Ford Foundation's largest grant in the 1960s was not for economic development. It was to the School of American Ballet, because we wanted to have a great ballet school to beat the Russians. So we had Balanchine and New York City Ballet. And that wasn't just about art. That was about power and influence on the global stage. And we're seeing the same thing happen here, just as it should be happening here, because there is so much rich culture here. My only hope about what I see in this region is that you assert your indigenous, authentic culture as something to be proud of. Not that you need to have me as an American come to valorize, or to have an American institution say, we'll wave our wand over you and you can be on the global stage. There's something very, very remarkable about this region of the world that is not known to most of the world, because the story of culture has been told by Europeans. And so it's why in the United States we don't have, still today, a full understanding of our own American culture. Because our own American culture, the true breadth and depth and richness of it has actually not been given a space.
Well, we don't even appreciate the origins of it all.
No.
Whether the origins are African or from the Middle East or whatever. And, you know, hopefully one of the things we'll talk about, and we'll do it in a variety of ways here, is how these flows of culture around the world actually have taken place. And you can listen to it in Sandeep's music from India and how that influences music in the Middle East. And then you could see how the influence in the Middle East came when during the Moorish period in Spain, and that then tied into the age of discovery and exploration, which
Yes.
brought it to the Americas. And some of that music in the Americas became tango music, which then came back to Spain, and it started to change it again. And you know, we are all connected in this cultural flow, and that's why every part of the world has a claim to be made here. But it's
Just to respond with you, Darren's impassioned remarks, and I am sorry to do a plug, but I really would like to invite and encourage everyone to come to see places that foundations have been at the forefront here, like Warehouse 421 is an SHF, so I have to have a disclaimer. But El Serkal Avenue in Dubai, or Sharjah Art Foundation in Sharjah, to see these indigenous, these kind of locally authentic, kind of based in the community art spaces.
When
that are
those
popping
places-
up because of all the foundations that the government has been able to lay. And the importance that it's put on has really allowed foundations to kind of expand.
When I think, by the way, we see them all over the world. I was in Shenzhen. There's one in Shenzhen. If you go to Shanghai or Singapore, you go to Beijing and 798. Every one of these places exists in the world, and they are a network. When we take that network and we start applying it to social change, and we start trying to respond to what Darren's talking about, the question becomes who leads. Is it the guy who writes the check or the woman who writes the check, or is it the artist? And I think that there is implicit in what you were saying is the artist has to lead. The artist has to respond to the problem. The artist is the pioneer that says this is where we go. But I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what I'm hearing.
No, definitely. It shouldn't be the money. And that's a problem, of course, also with, sponsorship and those things we all know. And that's why they're definitely in need. I see another gap, and I just wanted to raise that. And hopefully this summit can fill that gap a bit, that we are still so divided. We are talking about that we are all connected, but we are still divided. We are in our bubbles. Before, I worked in a social NGO, and we were in social NGOs, and we had conferences for social NGOs. And of course, the smaller ones were against the bigger ones. The larger ones were against the smaller ones. You have that in the arts. Then we have the economy side. They have Davos. So it's totally fragmented, as a good colleague would say. We have to stop this. We have to bring different people together. And if we are talking about innovation and no artist is there, it's no innovation. If we are talking about an innovation lab, there is no artist, it's not innovation. So we have to bring different people together. And of course, that means including the poor, that means including the science, that means, and we have to think differently. But that's what we still have not learned. Our conferences are bubble conferences, most of them. So hopefully this is a beautiful starter to rethink that and bring different players together, because otherwise we stay in our comfort zone and we do the same and we will not change.
You see why Werner is such a good friend, right? that he says, you know, we need a certain kind of conference that breaks down silos, that breaks down walls, that connects people across sectors, but that connects people also across geographic divides and cultural divides, and creates a conversation like this. And we agree. We agree that we need that kind of conference, and that's exactly what this is, and that's exactly where we're going. Now, the problem with little, you know, half-hour long conversations like this that are so rich, as appetizers, as we said, is that if you have enough appetizers, you really want to have the main course, which is lunch. And lunch is the next thing on our agenda. And where lunch is going to take place, you go through the gallery and down the hall, and we have an amazing room that has been created just for this event, where we're going to have a lunch, we're going to have another performance, we're going to introduce you to the people who are going to run the workshops, and then you'll come back into these workshops, which are also amazing, and we'll create then the next phase of this. In the evening tonight, we're going to honor our artists in residence, who are in a remarkable group of people. And then tomorrow night, we'll also do the Cultural Diplomats Dinner. There's an amazing schedule. It, by the way, goes straight through to Thursday, when we culminate with a big dance performance called The Way of the Rain, created by Billy Redford, about, that shows everything we're talking about here, about how you can use the arts to advance a social good, in this case, taking care of the one planet we've got. So it's great. There's a lot of great stuff going, and there could be no better proof of that than this wonderful panel. Please join me in thanking them.
Thank you very much.
That was great. That was really, really great. Thank you very much. Thank you. That was great.